Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Caroline Boyd, the Director of Government Programs at Meritalk. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Next Generation Data Centers, Taking the Right Steps. We're looking forward to a great discussion. Before we get started today, I would like to thank Vion and Dell EMC for their partnership and support on this webinar. Without the public-private collaboration, we wouldn't be able to have these types of conversations, so thanks to both for their support. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes for our attendees that are on the line. I know many of you will be receiving CPE credits for today's webinar. If you do plan to receive credits, you will need to answer each of the 3 polling questions that will be put on the screen throughout today's webinar. Please respond to those polling questions, and at the end of the webinar, the contact information for the person who can provide you your CPE credit certification will be on the screen, and just be in touch with her and she'll make sure you get your certification. Also, for all attendees today, if you have questions throughout our discussion, you will see that there is a sort of floating toolbar and a Q&A box on your screen. Please feel free to put any of your questions into that toolbar throughout the discussion, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible at the end of the conversation. I'd like to jump right into it. We have a full panel today, and we know that there's probably a lot of conversation for us to have, so I want to make sure we maximize our time. I would like to welcome those panelists. As I said, I'm Caroline Boyd, the Director of Government Programs at Meritalk. My job is to keep everything on track today. We have Dominic Sal. He is the Assistant Commissioner of Operations for Fast Technology Transformation Services, known to most of you as TTS at GSA. We have Rob Davies, the Executive Vice President of Operations at Vion, and we also are pleased to have Steve Harris, the Vice President and General Manager at Dell EMC. Now, before we sort of dive into our discussion, I'd like to give all 3 of them an opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit more, with a little more of their background. So, Rob, if you don't mind, we'll start with you.
Certainly. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Dominic and Steve, for joining us today. I've been in the federal IT industry for 25 years and have a lot of experience around enterprise, what we used to call enterprise data centers, and supporting the applications and systems in those data centers, and now manage the delivery and operations of that technology for Vion's customers.
Great, thanks, Rob. Dominic.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for inviting me here today. So I'm the Govy on the call, but I have about 50% of my career experience has been in the government, and 50% is serving the government as a contractor. So I've seen kind of the IT modernization, data centers from both ends. In my current role, which I've been in since January of this year, focused on building a team that goes into agencies and provides strategic and hands-on assistance in modernization projects. You may have heard of the Centers of Excellence. It's kind of our latest venture, which we're really excited about at USDA. But before then, I was in GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy, where I started the Data Center Optimization Initiative in close coordination with my friends at OMB. And prior to that, I was at OMB I'm working on a variety of policy fronts. So I've seen the evolution of kind of the data center consolidation, optimization, kind of objectives from a policy perspective for several years now, and I'm excited where we are now, and I'm really happy to be part of this discussion today.
Thanks, Dominic, and we're glad to have you join us, especially with your background on the Data Center Optimization Initiative, given the topic we're going to jump into in a moment. So, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks. First of all, I would like to thank Dominic and his team for their service to our country. The critical work that you all have been executing on helping agencies with their transformational strategies, it's Dell's belief that is one of the most critical agenda items that the government faces today, bar none. Certainly one of the only topics where we have clear bipartisan support, I think reinforces how critical it is to our country. And I think that you and your team have just done groundbreaking work helping agencies understand how to engage with these initiatives. So thank you very much for your service. And honored to be here with Rob, Vion's one of the greatest next generation IT companies serving the federal space today. Dell EMC is a company that goes from the desktop to the data center to the cloud. We have a very broad portfolio of capability, and I'm very pleased to serve as the senior leader for the overall federal business at Dell EMC. Responsibility is from pre-sales to post-sales. Globally, everything that the government is trying to accomplish with technology, generally we're working with just about every agency, every place the government goes. So we're really appreciative of that work. Thanks a lot again for being here today.
Thank you, Steve. So the focus of our discussion today, I would just like to share what the objectives are, and then we'll jump into the questions. We're going to talk about how agencies can and are optimizing their data centers, but also still maintaining those mission-critical legacy systems, although I'm sure we'll dive into MGT and what that really means for some of these legacy systems. I think it's more the legacy functions, right, that we're looking to maintain. And with the recent passage of MGT, as we all know, many IT leaders are thinking about how to leverage the new funding opportunities that are there and how that can help them with their various modernization efforts. And we'll also dive in a little bit into what a next generation of data centers will look like and how the current initiatives and policy efforts on the table are going to help us achieve that. So to kick things off, let's maybe start with a definition, and what are we actually talking about? So Rob, maybe starting with you, how would you describe a next generation data center?
Thanks, Caroline. I don't think we'll describe it the way we have in the past. I even said it on my introduction, cutting my teeth in enterprise, or what we used to call enterprise data centers. I don't think, or I can say for certain, they're not going to be defined how we used to define them. Like, my data center is this many square feet with this much power and has this many MIPS and this much storage and does these things. It's going to be talked about in terms of functionality, I believe. What is that delivering? Because in the future, right, that next generation data center, that next generation capability is not going to be delivered exclusively from the data center. Right, we're in a world where some of that workload is already moving to, in the government's case, the public clouds for government and the various hyperscalers. But it's going to be about the ability to deliver a workload supporting the agency mission, and to do so in a more agile way, to do it securely, to do it with those systems and that set of data that really should be managed on-prem, but is on a very flexible infrastructure that allows those workloads to migrate either between data centers or back and forth to the public cloud, or access data wherever it may be. So it's not going to be, how many of those I have and how big or large they are. It's about the functionality that they're going to be able to provide and how they interact with the public cloud. And then the government's challenge, I think, will be how the IT organizations of agencies transform over the next few years to really be able to support that model. Because right now, I think that's something that's lagging as we think about optimization, is how the organizational structures of the IT shops and various agencies are still very much legacy.
You hit on a lot of core things there. Steve, do you have anything to add to functionality, mission support, and organizational transformation as being critical to how we are defining the next generation of data centers?
Well, I'm in complete agreement with Rob's comments. And one of the things he mentioned was, in my mind, he's talking about really optimally supporting the mission critical workloads of the federal government. A workload is really, made up of users engaging with software that's running on hardware, right, to really oversimplify it. And when we do a great job of providing a data center resource and all the equipment in that data center to support workloads, we focus on really high availability, so lots of nines of availability, really high security, super density, optimized power consumption. And the great news is that the technologies that we need to actually deliver on those sorts of optimal capabilities is actually some of the lowest cost, easiest to implement technologies in the market today. So this is all very achievable.
Dom, I don't know if government's looking at it any differently, but you're welcome to chime in.
So I'm less apt to opine on what the optimal data center is tomorrow or what it looks like tomorrow, because I think technology is of such. If I try to pin it down, it's like trying to pin down Jell-O. I think what we really need to focus on is the situation we're in now, which is that we're spending in excess of 80% of our federal IT dollars maintaining aging infrastructure and essentially throwing money out the window that could be better purposed towards serving our citizens. So the way I look at it is, we need to be very mindful of what we've got. Look at, make sure we understand what we're spending on storage and hosting. Make sure we understand what we're spending on real estate, what we're spending on energy, and be very deliberate about that. And then be very deliberate about planning to get out of that situation. And, we've got to break this down to the workload or the application level and figure out where each application, whatever we're trying to do, look at all the options. Putting it in another data center, maybe the last one down the line. I say kill first, cloud next, and then data center. Maybe that's the third option. So what can we get rid of that we're doing today? What is appropriate for kind of a more high-touch cloud, software as a service, platform as a service, and then what really requires what requires infrastructure and what requires infrastructure that we own and operate ourselves. So the solution is much more complex than the problem is easy to state. So I just think that agencies, as long as they're focused on the problem, which is that we are spending an inordinate amount of taxpayer dollars on running things that we could run much cheaper. I think if we focus on moving away from that and planning for the future, I think that's where I want to guide us. And I think it's companies like we have on the line here that are going to provide those technology solutions to help us get there.
Well, that actually fits pretty well with what you're all seeing on the screen and the quote from Dave Bowner. So I guess what I'm asking you is it realistic? I mean, Dave said in a hearing last month it's focused right on this next generation data centers. That one of his suggestions was that we set a firm date for legacy systems to actually be turned off. Do you think that's realistic? I think it jives with your comment on kill being one of the first things that we need to be looking at.
The federal environment's complex. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. So, what's realistic for some agencies may not be for others. That's a conversation between the agencies and OMB, frankly. Our role here at GSA is to facilitate in the best way we can, to provide services, modernization services to the agencies and help them get there toward the aggressive targets laid out by OMB. So, whether or not it's realistic to hit targets is maybe perhaps from my perspective less important than making steady progress toward those targets. And that's why, that's where the COEs come in, that's where 18F comes in, all the platforms we provide to assist agencies, give them a leg up in this really tough battle they've got ahead of them.
Yeah, so Steve or Rob, I don't know if you want to jump on that with sort of, GAO's perspective from the hearing last week that we have up on the screen right now, given what Dominic is sharing.
I'm happy to chime in. I really like what Dominic mentioned around planning. You have to have a good strategy, and I really like what Dave Bowner says about optimizing by 2020. Because there's a tremendous amount of progress that most customers, most federal agencies can make in that period of time. It requires good planning, and it requires us to work from a contracting perspective to allow agencies to actually consume technology as solutions. We talk about, as a service. Almost anything can be acquired today on-premise or off-premise as a service. And so I like to think of it as, design, implement, and sustain everything as a service on-premise, or consider the alternative of off-premise, or consider the alternative of hybrid. But don't force the agencies into a scenario where they have to buy, things widget by widget by widget, and then figure out how to piece them together and make them work. That's where we won't see the progress necessary that Pounder's asking for by 2020.
So, Rob, a little bit of what Steve's touching on is what it really is going to take to make transformation happen and some of the actual steps. Your thoughts on what IT transformation is going to look like over the next couple of years, that as it relates to sort of getting out of the data center business, as Dave says.
And I think Steve's absolutely right, and more of that holistic managed service approach, right? As I alluded to before, you've got some organizational transformation issues as well, and as you think about where those workloads need to reside and which ones maybe are no longer necessary, which ones are going to go to the public cloud, and which ones maybe stay in some sort of managed arena, then I think those government resources should be deployed to making sure the agency's getting the most out of those workloads, out of that application set, and that delivery of the underlying technology is being delivered as a managed service, and the functioning of the technology, and all those the widgets that Steve referred to, but getting them to work together and doing the patching and making sure that the technology set functions. And with certainly the broadest portfolio in the marketplace, Dell EMC has many options to deliver something like that in a very coherent, consistent fashion, and leveraging industry's expertise in that arena, I think really helps us get to that transformation sooner, and then having the government IT organizations focus on how they support the mission of that agency with the improvement of applications, the delivery of those services to the citizenry, is a really efficient dichotomy of effort and labor right there, and the type of partnership I think we need to drive to in the federal IT marketplace. So I think that if we make progress by 2020, where agencies are starting to look at their on-premise infrastructure delivery as a resource that they're going to manage, and one day it might be a larger amount, 2 months later they might not need some because it's a seasonality issue, that helps them optimize their budget, and the MGT Act with its working capital funds might allow some greater flexibility in how those are procured and managed, but it's going to look like that, I hope. It's going to be about leveraging industry for the efficiencies we can deliver in running the technology for the government, and the government focused on the workload, the citizenry, the mission of that agency, and making it the most optimal experience it can be.
Thanks, Rob.
I'd like to ride on that point. I think it's a really great point. There's a clear role for government. There's a clear role for industry. The devil is in the details, in that middle space where government cannot abdicate the responsibility for understanding, for having visibility into the technologies. I'm not saying manage those technologies, but there needs to be transparency that happens between the government consumer and frankly the responsibility of the IT folks within the agencies to make sure that the companies are kind of held accountable. And I think that there's an ecosystem and there's a balance that needs to be maintained here. And I say this because I think we've seen in the past where there were situations where agencies had essentially outsourced much of their IT functions, and it was a failure because the government didn't do enough to ensure that accountability, visibility into the contract, into understanding what was going on. And I feel like that may have set us back. So whatever we do moving forward, and I think this is great, it's an important conversation to have, there has to be transparency and trust built on both ends. And the government needs that expertise, at least to a certain level, to make sure that its needs are being set, not just understanding the mission needs and be able to articulate those, but the technical needs and understanding their own infrastructure, their own IT. And this all comes back to kind of workforce issues within the government, making sure we have the right skill set. So, and acquisition, of course, making sure that the people who are acquiring these services, especially, when we're talking about big dollar, highly complex infrastructure, cloud plays, that we on our government side have that expertise and are able to make sure we are educated consumers of these services.
Thanks, Dom. Definitely accountability, transparency, critical. For those receiving CPE credits, we have a quick poll question here on the screen coming next. I'm just going to take 10 seconds, let folks respond to this, and then we'll continue on with the conversation. Okay. Interesting that for the folks, at least on this webinar, still meeting the mandates and requirements is their top concern when it comes to moving next-gen data centers forward. Dom, you mentioned earlier, I just want to pull on a thread from the previous conversation. You did mention earlier that we are spending 80% of our annual federal IT budget, and I think everyone here on the phone knows it when it comes to just maintaining outdated legacy systems. And that I think there's a real result in that we are moving in a reactive crisis management rather than an investment in a proactive towards innovative solutions. So in the GAO's Data Center Optimization Report that was released last month in March and that Dave talked about on the Hill, agencies reported limited progress towards meeting the original 2018 deadlines, and so everything has been pushed back to 2020. What do you all feel about that pushback to 2020? Is it realistic with current funding and the political environment? I don't know, Steve, if you want to take that.
Well, we're talking about dismantling $8 billion of technical debt, to make this to make the progress necessary. We're never gonna get all the way there. But the problem's been getting worse incrementally year over year for the last decade rather than getting better. So, we have some of the fundamentals in place now, like FITARA, which puts the CIO, in charge of the IT budget, gives them more de facto discretion over priorities and things of that nature. So if we're gonna make the progress necessary, we have to set the right priorities. We have to have a good plan. We have to determine what our transformational initiatives are that make the most sense to tackle first. There's a lot of the work that we will do will actually save money in our annual operating costs. So, as you use some of the funding, let's say you're able to get funding through the MGT Act, and or you use the funding in the MGT Act to represent good justification for why you can get internal funding in your agency to take on a project. Right? The theme here is that we set the precedent that it's important to fund IT transformation projects. And in particular, it's critical that we focus on IT modernization. That's things like Unix to Linux and open systems, modernizing the mainframe environment, whether that's staying on mainframe and modernizing the environment or migrating some applications to open systems. Things like standardization of operating systems from on x86 environments, moving to shared services, transforming IT to IT as a service. All of these things optimize spend to mission value and allow for significant progress pretty rapidly, against the 2020 goal.
Rob, what are some of the steps, just to add to what Steve's talking about, that agencies need to be looking at to ensure they can meet those 2020 deadlines?
Well, I couldn't have said it any better. I'd simply elaborate a little bit on the that planning process that Steve mentioned at the very beginning. That 2020 I don't think is a realistic goal where they're going to have finalized and modernized, but having that plan, picking systems that are perhaps the ones, let's call it ripe for modernization, or where that are the biggest drag, or that require a tremendous amount of funding to keep operating, and have a plan to modernize those systems, or make that value proposition better for that agency, and make progress to that between now and 2020. I think that's very realistic, and I think that's really what was meant. Was we need to reverse what, and Steve's correct, it's just gotten incrementally worse. We haven't gotten any better on this modernization route, and we need to correct that trend because adding to that technical debt is not a sustainable budgetary proposition.
It's like harboring billions of dollars of credit card debt. If you don't eradicate the principle, it's only going to get worse every month that goes by.
I think it's an easy analogy for people to understand when you put it that way, Steve. Dominic, I don't know if you have any comment on that. Otherwise, I'm going to shift over to talk a little bit about MGT, which I know you'll have some input on.
Yeah, just a brief comment. I think that analogy is great, right? We're in this death spiral situation where agencies are starved for the capital they need to do what they need to do, and at the same time faced with all the kind of complexities and extra hurdles that it is to be a federal agency. But always starts with leadership. So I'm really encouraged to see what's happening at USDA, where the Secretary, Sonny Perdue, has really taken it as one of his top priorities to modernize. He gets that you can't do what you need to do to serve the citizenry without attacking IT first. I think there are many agencies that are probably like-minded, and there are probably a handful out there who just don't get that yet. But we need to make sure that those agencies where leadership feels like it's got that kind of objective, that they feel supported, and we've got the tools to give them to make sure they can be successful. But at the end of the day, it's really, really hard to modernize, and that's why you're not seeing a lot of agencies able to do it effectively.
Right, and I think the definition of modern changes with each minute that passes, right? With what is modern. But looking at the Modernizing Government Technology Act, obviously it did not get funded at the levels initially proposed. But I mean, I think as you noted in the beginning, Dominic, it still lends a lot of positive support to help agencies with the idea that modernization is critical. Now, I know that agencies need to apply with their proposals that outline exactly what they want to do. I know that there have been maybe 20 or so initial applications already received. The Technology Modernization Fund Board will begin looking at those. And, of course, I know at GSA and particularly within TTS, you all are you have folks that are participating in that process through the Fund Board. But what factors do you think agencies really need to prioritize to create that successful execution strategy when it comes to either trying to get some of these funds or at least what they're going to do once they get them?
So I think there are a variety of factors. I think one thing that we need to make sure that the applications for this money, and as stewards of the TMF here at JSA, we take this commitment very seriously. We need to make sure that the agencies have the capacity to undertake what they're doing. We need to make sure that what they're doing is serving the best interests of the public. They're built in an agile way, so we can, if we're going to fail, we fail fast. And that they promote kind of the health and sustainability of the fund. I love just the nature that this fund exists is very exciting to someone who's been around and been frustrated by our ability to modernize. I think it represents a new tool. It's not the only tool in the toolbox, and it is not meant to be a cure-all for federal IT. But what it does is it is that little boost of capital that some agencies need to get over that initial hump when it comes to modernization. In many cases, we are stewards of very important data, information, systems, that are expensive to maintain and to modernize. In a lot of cases, to go from the old to the new, we need to double pay to make sure we got the old stuff covered while we're getting the new stuff going, and we have trust built in it. So I think this helps with that initial investment. But we also need to make sure that we are fiscally responsible and we're getting payback on this fund, because this fund will be initially capitalized, but we want to make sure it's sustaining so all agencies can benefit from it down the line. So as you mentioned, we do have a board set up, an office here under the deputy administrator, and we are working away and excited about really taking this new tool and put it to use. I would also mention the underexplored, I think appreciated part of the TMF is the ability for agencies to establish working capital funds. Surprisingly, you may or may not be surprised to know that many agencies don't have this capability or not an adequate fund to do what they need to do. TMF or the MGT kind of encourages these working capital funds, which can be a revolving source of modernization efforts within the agencies. So again, not a silver bullet, but when we're talking about the frustration of being able to modernize, it's yet one more tool we've got available that acknowledges one of the big difficulties out there, which is the agency's ability to raise capital.
Right, and it also shows that there is support for this effort at higher levels, which I know also can be frustrating to folks in the IT trenches at times as well. Steve or Rob, do you want to add on here?
One thing I would say is that we tend to look at cloud as a destination when really we should consider it an operating model. And when you're looking at solving these problems through assessment, planning, and then executed implementation, it's useful to have the option to bring these capabilities in, and I think we should look at them as capabilities, whether it's off-prem or on-prem. So the option to bring these capabilities in either off-prem or on-prem, and as a service, as a solution. And I think that if we give agencies the ability, to fund solutions on or off-prem, that we'll not only optimize more rapidly, but we will optimize more effectively.
Rob?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Steve, and we have conversations like that all the time about cloud as a capability, as the third platform, as it were, and we just need to utilize that platform, and it's a great platform. We just need to utilize it effectively. I do think that the working capital fund is a vital tool in this modernization effort. It is, as Dom said, it's not the be-all, end-all, but it's definitely a tool that will give agencies that have not had it before. It's going to give them more flexibility and agility. And I do think there's a lot we can do with dollars today, particularly with as a service, and the technology is available through hyper-converged infrastructures, particularly. Steve mentioned about the densities earlier in the conversation we can achieve, that we can modernize infrastructure and that I think more rapidly certainly than the applications, in order to ready them for whatever their final destination might be, particularly with legacy platforms. But that modernizing to those hyper-converged infrastructures can dramatically increase density, increase the efficiencies of the compute underneath, reduce all the traditional power, cooling, operational maintenance expenses that go along with hardware, and agencies don't have to look at it through the same legacy lens of, and then if you wrap all that in as a service, I don't have that tremendous capital outlay up front. I can use what I need when I need it, and I can get it delivered on or off prem to help me make those optimization and modernization movements and execution. So I think it's utilizing all the tools that industry can offer and that government experience can drive to help us get there and make as much progress as we can in the next couple of years.
It was an astute point. You know, the degree that the funds can be used as OPEX to avoid the big capital costs of a massive on-site implementation. That will make the fund go further, probably more than any other one thing.
I have to interrupt for just a second while we throw out another poll question for attendees receiving their CPE credits. We'll take 15 seconds, and if everyone can respond to this poll question on how satisfied are you with your agency's data center modernization progress to date? And while folks are responding to that, just a reminder, if you have questions, I see there are a few questions coming in already. Please use that Q&A toolbox on the floating toolbar, and in a few minutes we'll get to your questions. Okay. Middle of the road. So, Steve, you mentioned a couple times here the benefits of hyperconverged technology and some of these next-gen movements that are not really just on the horizon, but here for a lot of folks, and how this is going to help advance. You know, there's the policy pieces going on, but let's talk a little bit about the technology options as well. What exactly, maybe just real quick, what exactly is hyperconverged infrastructure, and what are some of the benefits when it comes to what we're talking about today with next-gen data centers?
Well, it's probably less well understood than it could or should be. Traditionally, people have bought servers, they've bought networking, they bought storage, and these were three different tiers of infrastructure that then had to be integrated and managed, sustained, supported to work together to provide infrastructure to run software. And today, we've actually virtualized those layers where we actually have a modern software-defined IT infrastructure that actually takes both the storage as well as the networking and software defines it, virtualizes it, and runs it on a server. So you're taking a tremendous amount of integration complexity out, allowing for much easier implementation when you get rid of the three tiers and move to that software-defined capability. So in short, it's software defining the three tiers to a single tier environment.
And benefits, you mentioned earlier, just a comment on cost.
There's a very significant acquisition cost savings by actually buying hyper-converged rather than separately acquiring the three-tier architecture. Now, there are workloads out there. This is a workload by workload equation. There's workloads out there that are highly critical, so they're mission critical. They have very significant I/O, so high performance requirements, where three-tier architectures are still absolutely optimal. But more often than not, and in almost every circumstance, we should consider modernizing those three-tier architectures to software defined. It offers ease of administration, a number of different elements of advantages for cybersecurity, and also allows for better integration from a hybrid cloud perspective with off-premise software-defined environments.
So it is also then really allowing or enabling this idea of a multi-cloud or maybe multi-data center environment.
It's a great way to get to a much lower cost, more dense, optimized data center that works and integrates in a hybrid fashion off-premise much more rapidly and effectively with a much lower cost of administration.
Rob, I don't know if this plays into any thoughts you have too on how the technology is really enabling the transformation that we've been discussing on the previous slides.
No, Steve, I think really hit it on the head. He nailed it in terms of what hyperconverged can do. When we talk about hyperconverged for our customers and its benefits, we talk about it in terms of its ability to help bridge to that hybrid cloud, to help bridge between bridge to the hybrid cloud, bridge to the off-prem data center, but and get the applications. And again, not all applications can migrate to and benefit from hyperconverged, as Steve said, but there's still quite a few. I won't say majority, but there's a high percentage of workload in the federal government that could migrate to hyperconverged, see performance improvements, take advantage of the densities that Steve talked about, the maintenance and all those costs we just mentioned. And then that helps ready you for, okay, great, now I'm in a much stronger position to determine, okay, these workloads are well suited to the public cloud, and I'm going to then migrate there from here, but now I'm going to keep these other workloads on this hyperconverged, optimized for that platform. And again, they make for an easily administrative platform, and that also has implications for your IT organization. And I know that's on the next slide or two, but I think it has some really significant organizational implications.
Great. So let's look at the next slide. Challenges and solutions. Just quickly, you'll see here that nearly all federal IT managers say that their agencies need help to accelerate this data center modernization progress. And you'll see here on the slide some of the requests. We've, of course, touched on the funding coming from MGT. But obviously, there's still a lot of challenges that agencies are facing as they go through this. I think all three of you have said in various ways that modernization is hard, and it has some complexities that it's not as easy as you think. So, but we've got a lot of emerging technologies, new applications, IoT. We've got 5G coming. How can we ensure that federal agencies' data centers can keep pace and stay at least with the innovation? I don't know if they can stay ahead of it, but with the innovation that's coming. Rob, I don't know if you want to pull that thread first, just from your previous comment.
Sure. Well, I don't think I think that's the point, right? Is that with the different tools that we've been talking about through the session today, is and Dom's absolutely right in his earlier comment. We talked about still maintaining an understanding of the technology and the acquisition models and transparency there, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to understand the bits and the bytes of how to operate it. And if we can appropriately balance, what industry is doing and what government's doing, then government shouldn't have to worry about keeping pace with the technology as much as keeping pace with the ability to exploit the technology in a very effective way in the service of the citizenry or the mission. And I think, that's where the shifting of the organization comes into play, because we get, with that three-tiered architecture, there's a three-tiered organizational structure. I've got my compute administrators, whatever the compute is, my network administrators, and my storage administrators fundamentally, and then, of course, the security people that overlay that. Others as well, not diminishing that, but simply that's the core to maintaining that three-tier architecture. And if you move into an environment where a lot of that's being provided as a managed service, then it's about understanding, how do I effectively use those resources? I mean, that's the whole point of hyperconverged, is I don't need a separate storage, compute, and network administrator, although unbelievably, I have customers that buy hyperconverged and take it apart because it needs to fit into their IT organization. So, that's exactly what we have to stop doing, and recognizing this is a resource to be managed, and if you can manage that hyperconverged resource like a cloud resource, then you can make real progress to how you manage those resources in the public cloud. It's going to be about resource management and provisioning, not the legacy architecture of storage management, network management, and compute management.
Dom, how about you? Because I know, some of what your office is doing is going out and working with some of the agencies to help them be able to achieve some of these efforts.
Yeah, so I'm looking at this slide, and it resonates so strongly with me, and I would say GSA is in some way trying to address each of these. Now, to the point on increased staff training, I think what that's really saying is making sure we have the right people with the right technical expertise and the right roles in our agencies. It's hard to recruit. The pay differential is a big issue in the government. I think what we provide with 18F and the COEs is kind of an aggregation of that talent that can be deployed as needed within the agencies. Some of these positions, you don't need people for the long term, so agencies are either reluctant to hire them or they don't hire them at all. So what we can do is provide kind of resources to parachute in and help agencies and work by their side as government employees, but also kind of being that liaison between government and translator between government and industry to make sure not just that government's immediate needs are being met, but to help train them up, to help bring kind of those good IT practices. I think say something that is in that same vein as kind of new kind of skills or improved skills is really the IT management skills. We talk a lot about technical skills and understanding the bits and bytes, and that's a great point. We don't need to be super technical on very specific technologies. We need to have good generalists who understand how technology works. But where I think we fall down, and which I think harkens also back to data center optimization and the planning, is IT management. There's people who understand not the bits and bytes, but the zeros and ones of the finances, who understand capital expenses versus operational expenses, and can really guide broad macro decisions on how agencies deploy technology. Easier said than done, and FITARA is a step in the right direction, but agencies are in general, especially the bigger ones, very fragmented, federated. So it takes, again, strong leadership to get those federated agencies kind of work all rowing in the same direction. But then GSA is also helping with Management Act, with the TMF, and providing more flexible procurement options. So GSA and Federal Acquisition Service, where TTS lies, provides very kind of self-serve options to very high-touch types of acquisition support that you see with FedSim or our acquisition team in 18F, where we'll work with the agencies to help write up the contracts, write up the proposals, to make sure that we are getting what we really need, and we're asking for that from industry, and have mechanisms to keep kind of contract oversight into place. So I think that these are great. These are all the challenges we see at GSA. We hear from our customer agencies, and that we're trying to address with all the programs we've got here.
Thanks, Dom. I think I heard from one of the folks at GSA, Joanne Collins-Smee. She said it's not necessarily people, process, and technology. It's people, process, and procurement when it comes to a lot of the modernization effort. So that certainly this slide on challenges and solutions speaks to that.
Could I
yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Just one real quick comment, because I think we covered it really well. But there are a couple of specific priorities that will help us move forward more rapidly, and it's increased staff training. I agree with Dominic's comments, but I also see a lot of demand for specific capabilities. Like I want to learn how to move to software, agile software development. I know that if I can move to agile, that I can build software more rapidly and make releases more rapidly and modernize the software that is running on different platforms more rapidly. So I see agile as a big hitter. I also see from a prioritization perspective, that the move to information technology as a service, right? And this isn't a product. This is an IT delivery model as being super critical. Because when we do our application rationalization, when we really figure out what we're spending our IT dollars on as it pertains to the work that our IT staff is doing, the hardware and software that we're managing on our networks, and then we actually rationalize that against the priorities of the agency and the mission that we're serving, and then create a multi-year strategic plan to make sure that we're doing that really optimally. I think that is a big key to unlock progress.
Thanks, Steve. In the interest of time, we have a final poll question, and then we're going to get to some Q&A here in a minute. But you'll see here on your screen, for those attendees getting their CPE credits, our final poll question: is your agency considering applying for MGT Act funding or setting up a working capital fund? I'm not sure if everybody can answer that, but look forward to the response here in a few seconds. Looks like yes has the dominance there on the answers. So one final topic that we wanted to touch on before we open it up to Q&A. You'll see here FITARA, and we know that there's some new scorecards that should be coming out soon. But in one of the recent reports that Meritalk did, we found that the majority of federal IT managers did not notice an increase in any of their optimization efforts following the FITARA scorecards. And we know that it's not the greatest grade showing up on those report cards. But what are your all thoughts on how FITARA and those scorecards could be pushing people towards optimization, and if there are things that could be done to redesign those scorecards or make a change that could really help agencies move towards modernization and transformation in a more positive vein? I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that one on the front end. Rob, Steve?
Sure, I can.
Go ahead.
That was Dom or Steve?
I was just going to say real quick, it's pretty challenging when we're managing IT by a scorecard. I see a lot of benefit with the specific goals that have been set and that we're attempting to measure with these scorecards. At the same time, having worked across the Fortune 500, I've never seen a scorecard used to manage a CIO of a major multinational corporation. And these agencies often have bigger, more complex environments than a lot of these commercial CIOs actually are responsible for. So it's tough to turn everything green on those scorecards. So
my take on scorecards is that they're only as powerful as leadership is paying attention to them. And if agency leads are taking them seriously and there's clear accountability built into the scorecard, which is another issue. Who is responsible for data center optimization at the end of the day? Because in agencies, it's not always that easy to have one throat to choke, figuratively speaking. I think that they're great. They're an important exercise, but they only really work if someone takes them seriously and there is accountability and consequences to not hitting the mark or rewards for hitting the mark. So I think that FITARA, very well intended, and I love what is trying to be done with FITARA. But let's make sure that we know who is specifically accountable for these actions and that we're very clear and realistic in what is being expected.
Thanks, Ed. Rob, a final word, and then I'm going to jump to some questions while we still have a few minutes.
No, thanks, Caroline. I agree with Dom, and that I think those scorecards were well intended, are misplaced, and they prescribe an activity that may or may not be correct for each agency.
Okay, let's go to some questions. I see that we have quite a few starting to line up here in the queue. I don't know how many we'll get to. I'll try to hit on a few that are particularly relevant to what we've been talking about. First question is, what do agencies need to do to maintain or improve their security during their consolidation? Steve, that might be for you.
Well, I can jump in first, Steve, if you want.
Yeah, go ahead, Dom.
A lot of the IT modernization efforts underway now, the catalyst was cybersecurity. Cyber events in the past here in the federal government kind of were a wake-up call that much of our vulnerability is caused by the aging infrastructure itself, and old technology in and of itself is a vulnerability, and the move to new technologies is in part, part of the solution. So I would look at it just as like good cyber is a natural consequence in many ways of modern technology and technological practices, and that the real risk is from the complexity and kind of insecurity of the way of legacy infrastructure.
Yeah,
Bob,
I think that's well stated.
Did you have a thought?
No, Steve, go ahead.
I think that's well stated. Flipping the 80-20 requires keeping the lights on, but the cyber elements have to be considered before anything else. And just taking care of the basics, things like dual factor authentication as one example. When you look at all and I know we're going off on a cyber tangent here, but it's actually always a great use of time. When you look at all the major breaches, it has to do with basically just not executing on the fundamentals of cyber effectively. And so, to Dom's point, there's a lot of big undertakings necessary to start flipping the 80-20 and modernizing, but start with good cyber hygiene in your current state, and that will mark very significant positive progress.
All right, we only have about a minute, so I want to throw out a couple other quick questions. We'll try to have short answers. Is the technology, and I assume they're talking about HCI, is this technology proprietary from vendor to vendor?
Well, the software layer would be proprietary. It's for VxRail or VX Block 1000, which are two of our converged architecture solutions. One is a partnership with Cisco. The other is a Dell EMC VMware capability. The software layer is proprietary, but the beauty of the solutions and other HCI capabilities is that they integrate with all other open systems very, very well, and will run just about any software.
Great. Dom, one of the questions here you might be able to answer, and then we'll have to wrap, is how many of the CFO Act agencies have already established their own modernization funds? I assume they mean working capital funds, and I don't know if you know that or not.
I don't have the answer. I know there are people in OMB working on that. What I can tell you is that we are encouraged by in the TMF proposal, the number of proposals we're getting in on that. So we do see a strong appetite, which may or may not translate over to working capital funds in the agencies, but certainly from the TMF perspective, we are getting a fairly good level of activity and proposals coming in on that. And there's still time for agencies to submit proposals, so we're strongly encouraging you all to do so.
Thank you, Dom. We're out of time for today's webinar. I'm sorry that we can't get to more questions, but I would like to thank all of our panelists, Dom and Rob and Steve, for taking the time. An hour seems like a long time before you start, and it definitely isn't on some of the topics we touched on today. I'd like to thank Vion and Dell EMC for their support of today's webinar, and the webinar will be available afterwards for review. And if anyone has any questions, you can contact Kelly Power. Her contact is here, and particularly if you're looking to get your CPE credits, you'll be able to get that from her following the close of the webinar. So thank you all for your support today, and appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Much appreciated.